They called her the Baron's broken doll. Before the fall, Lady Ilara had been the melody of his court, a flash of sunlight in the grim stone halls of Caer Valerus. She had a mind as sharp as her wit and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees. But memory is a cruel artist, painting the past in colors the present can no longer afford. Now, she was defined not by what she was, but by what she was not. She was not whole. Her legs, once swift and sure on the dance floor or the back of a mare, were now lifeless things, beautiful and useless appendages left behind by the same riding accident that had claimed her mother and stolen her future. She was a living monument to tragedy, an imperfection her father, Baron Valerus, could no longer abide. The humiliation was to be a public spectacle. The Baron, a man whose ambition was a glacier grinding all warmth from his heart, had arranged a new marriage for himself, one that would bring fresh lands and a fertile, whole-limbed wife. Ilara was a stain on this pristine new tapestry. She had to be erased, but not with the mercy of a quick blade. No, her father's cruelty was a calculating, theatrical thing. He announced to the entire barony that he would, in an act of profound and feigned charity, unburden himself of his crippled daughter. He would not sell her for a bride price or barter her for influence. He would offer her, his only child, to any man in the courtyard for the symbolic price of a single copper coin. It was a declaration that she was worth less than the shoe on his horse, a piece of damaged property to be discarded. The day was a shroud of grey mist, clinging to the castle walls like a second skin. Ilara was carried down to the courtyard in her heavy, ornate chair, a throne of her own imprisonment. The fabric of her gown was worth a farmer's entire harvest, a bitter irony that clung to her as tightly as the damp air. She kept her gaze fixed on her own lap, on the hands that lay limp and pale against the deep blue silk. She could feel the stares of the crowd, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled contempt. They were the same people who had once bowed to her. Now they watched her abasement as a form of entertainment. Her father stood on the dais above, his voice a hammer striking the anvil of her spirit. He spoke of her as a burden, a cross he had borne with saintly patience. Each word was a fresh lash, stripping away the last vestiges of her pride until she felt utterly, terrifyingly naked. Among the crowd stood a man who did not belong. Calen was a spectre at the edge of the village, a man whose silence was as profound as the forest that bordered his small, isolated cottage. They called him the Mute Bard, a cruel paradox of a name. He carried a lute of polished ash wood, its strings pristine, but no one had ever heard him play a note or sing a verse. Grief had stolen his voice years ago, the same night a fire had stolen his wife and infant daughter, leaving him with nothing but smoke in his lungs and a silence that had calcified around his heart. He had come to the castle not for the spectacle, but to petition the Baron for rights to timber from the Lord's wood, a request he would make with a piece of charcoal on a small slate. But as he stood there, watching the Baron's performance, hearing the quiet, choked breaths of the woman in the chair, he felt an old, forgotten string vibrate deep within his chest. It was the resonance of shared brokenness. The Baron raised his hand for the final pronouncement. 1 copper coin, he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone. For the burden of my house. Who will take her? A wave of snickering and coarse laughter rippled through the onlookers. Men nudged each other, their eyes filled with scornful appraisal. No one moved. The silence stretched, a taut wire of humiliation meant to snap Ilara's spirit completely. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It was Calen. He did not look at the Baron. His eyes, deep pools of sorrow and something more, something fierce and protective, were fixed on Ilara. He walked to the foot of the dais, his movements deliberate, his presence a sudden, stark contrast to the court's gilded cruelty. He said nothing. He simply reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and produced a single copper coin, dull and greened with age. He held it out. A vein throbbed in Baron Valerus's temple. This was not the outcome he had envisioned. For a peasant, a mute, to answer his call was an insult beyond measure. But he was trapped by the cage of his own making, his declaration made before 100 witnesses. To refuse now would be to show weakness. With a snarl of contempt, he gestured to his guards. The coin was snatched from Calen's hand. The transaction was complete. Ilara felt a tremor of pure terror. She was being passed from a gilded cage to what? A hovel? A life of squalor and abuse at the hands of a stranger? The guards moved to lift her chair, but Kaelin held up a hand, stopping them. He walked to her, knelt so that their eyes were level, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a brute or a fool, but an ocean of quiet understanding. Then, with a strength that was startlingly gentle, he scooped her from the chair and into his arms. The world dissolved into a jarring montage of sensation. The scent of polished marble and cloying perfume was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of pine needles, wood smoke, and damp earth that clung to Kaelin's tunic. The cold, unyielding wood of her chair was gone, replaced by the solid warmth of a human chest, the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart against her back. He carried her out of the courtyard, away from the jeering faces and the stone gaze of her father. The journey was long, and for its entirety, Ilara kept her eyes squeezed shut, a silent, desperate prayer her only companion. When he finally stopped, the air was different, thicker with the smell of a hearth and drying herbs. He did not set her down carelessly. He moved with a reverence she had not been shown since she was a child, placing her on a simple cot covered with a surprisingly soft wool blanket. When she dared to open her eyes, she saw not a squalid hut, but a small, meticulously clean cottage. A low fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Copper pots, scrubbed to a dull shine, hung by the fireplace. He had placed her in what was clearly the cottage's only bed. For himself, there was only a straw pallet on the floor. He ladled warm broth from a kettle over the fire into a simple earthenware bowl and brought it to her. He didn't speak, of course, but his hands were steady as he offered it. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet, solemn respect that felt more valuable than all the gold in her father's vaults. She had expected cruelty, or at best, a grudging indifference. This unexpected gentleness was a fissure in the dam of her composure, and she had to fight back the sudden, sharp sting of tears. His silence was not an absence, it was a presence, a peaceful space where she was not required to perform or pretend. Days bled into one another, measured by the rising and setting of the sun through the cottage's single, small window. Ilara began to understand that Kaelin had not taken her for any gain. He had not sought a servant or a bed warmer. He had acted on an impulse she could not yet fathom, an act of pure, uncalculated compassion. He had seen a soul being crushed and had simply stepped in to shield it. This realization was a seed of trust planted in the barren soil of her heart. She was safe. For the first time in a decade, she felt truly safe. But with safety came a profound sense of uselessness. She watched him work, mending his tools, chopping wood, his powerful hands deft and capable. She was a mouth to feed, another blanket to wash, a fragile object to be moved from cot to chair. The feeling of being a burden, the one her father had so carefully branded onto her, returned with a dull ache. One evening, as rain pattered a soft drumbeat on the thatch roof, Kaelin took up his lute. He sat on the floor by the fire, his back to her, and his fingers moved over the frets with an innate, heartbreaking grace. The shapes of chords formed, silent and ghostly. His shoulders were tense with a terrible, frustrated longing. He wanted to make music, but the wellspring of his voice was sealed shut. Ilara watched him, her own heart aching in sympathy. In her former life, she had been tutored in poetry and song, her mind a repository of lyrical structures and melodic theory. Hesitantly, she cleared her throat. The progression, she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It could resolve to a minor key. It would better suit the sorrow. He turned, startled, as if he had forgotten she could speak. She gestured for the small slate and charcoal he used to communicate. On its surface, she scratched out a line of poetry, a verse about a caged bird that sings of the sky it can no longer reach. He read it, his dark eyes wide. He looked from the slate to her, and then back to his lute. His fingers found the new chord she had suggested. A soft, melancholic arpeggio bloomed in the quiet room, fragile and yet perfect. In that moment, a new purpose sparked within her. She could not mend his silence, but perhaps she could give his silence a voice. She could be the words to his music. This became their language. She would write, and he would play. The slate became a bridge between their two isolated worlds. He began to tell her his story in short, blunt phrases. Fire. Lyra, my wife. Elia, my daughter. Laughter like bells. Now, silence. The words were stark, but she could read the universe of pain behind them. His muteness was not a failing of the body but a scar on the soul, a self-imposed penance for having survived when they had not. Emboldened by his vulnerability, she told him of her own fire, the chaos of the fall, the splintering crack of her own spine, the sight of her mother's still form. She spoke of the years that followed, of her father's voice growing colder with each passing season, of the slow, creeping death of her own spirit. In the shared geography of their grief, they found a common ground, a place where their broken pieces seemed to fit together. One night, a savage autumn storm descended from the mountains, a howling beast of wind and rain. A violent gust tore a chunk of thatch from the roof, and a sudden, icy stream of water began to pour into the cottage, directly onto Ilara's cot. Before she could even cry out, Kalen was there. He swept the blankets around her and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. The single wooden chair by the hearth was the only dry place in the small home. He sat in it, holding her securely in his lap, her head resting against his shoulder. For hours they sat like that in the roaring dark, the storm raging outside, a fire dwindling to embers inside. He was a bulwark against the cold and the fear. She could feel the steady, reassuring strength in his arms, the warmth of his body a fortress around her. It was a proximity born of necessity, yet it was more intimate than any embrace she had ever known. No words were exchanged, but in the shelter of his hold, a new, unspoken truth was forged between them. Their life found its rhythm. Her voice, reading from the single volume of poems she had managed to bring with her, filled the silences. His music, coaxed from the lute by the lyrics she wrote, grew stronger, more complex. The sorrow was still there, a deep bass note beneath the melody, but now it was threaded with filaments of hope, of beauty. One afternoon, he presented her with a small, exquisitely carved wooden songbird, its tiny form so detailed she could almost see its feathers ruffle. It was not just a gift, it was a poem carved in wood, a confession he could not speak. It said, "I see you. You are not broken. You are beautiful." She accepted it, her fingers tracing the delicate wings, and knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she was falling in love with the mute bard. But the world does not long suffer such quiet pockets of peace to exist. Word of their arrangement had, of course, reached the ears of Baron Valerus. The thought that his discarded daughter might be finding a measure of contentment with a mute peasant was a galling insult to his pride. What he had thrown away could not be allowed to have value. His cruelty, once theatrical, now became insidious. He began to poison the village against them. Whispers followed Kalen when he went to market, that he was a degenerate, that the crippled woman was a curse upon the land. The blacksmith suddenly had no charcoal to sell him. The baker's wife turned him away with a cross word. The Baron was methodically, quietly, starving them out. The final siege came on a crisp, cold morning. Baron Valerus, flanked by two of his household guards, appeared at the door of the cottage. His lip curled in a sneer as he took in the humble scene. "I have come to rescue you from this squalor," he said to Ilara, his voice dripping with false concern. He intended to drag her away, to lock her in a remote convent where her spirit could be properly and finally crushed. He turned his venom on Kalen. "And you, mute dog. Did you think you could have what is mine?" He mocked his silence, his poverty, his powerlessness. It was then that something ignited in Ilara. A strength she did not know she possessed. She pushed herself up, her back ramrod straight. "He is more of a man in his silence than you will ever be with all your titles," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that startled them all, including herself. "His kindness is a kingdom. Your heart is a barren rock. There is nothing of value here for you to claim." Her defiance enraged the Baron. "You will learn your place," he hissed. He declared them both outcasts. He forbade any person in the barony from giving them aid or comfort upon pain of his wrath. He left them, in essence, to die. As the reality of their situation settled in, a deep despair fell over the cottage. They were utterly cut off. That night, huddled by a fire that was little more than a handful of glowing embers, facing the slow, inexorable creep of starvation, Ilara felt a tear slide down her cheek. Kaelan saw it glisten in the firelight. He took up the slate, his movement slow and deliberate. She thought he would write of their fear, of their hopelessness. But instead, with a small piece of charcoal, he wrote 3 words. "You are my song." In that moment of absolute desperation, he gave her the most beautiful thing he had. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with his strong, calloused ones. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "are my strength." It was a confession made at the edge of an abyss, a declaration of love that was their final, most powerful act of rebellion. In the bleak days that followed, a plan began to form in Ilara's mind, a weapon forged not of steel, but of intellect and memory. Locked away in the prison of her body, her mind had been her only true freedom, and she had filled it with the contents of her father's library. She recalled an old, obscure piece of feudal law, tucked away in a dusty legal tome. It concerned the inalienable rights of a daughter to her mother's dowry estate. The lands her mother had brought to the marriage were not her father's to absorb. Upon her mother's death, they passed directly to the sole female heir. The accident that crippled her had also made her a landowner. The auction had not just been cruel, it had been an illegal disinheritance. Her father, in his arrogance and greed, had overplayed his hand. Providence arrived in the form of a storm and a wandering friar. Brother Thomas, a man whose piety was etched in the kind lines of his face, sought shelter from the lashing rain. Kaelan welcomed him without hesitation, sharing their last piece of bread and the warmth of their fire. The friar witnessed their quiet, dignified poverty, the profound and gentle bond between them. When he learned their story, he was filled with a righteous anger. Ilara, seeing the genuine compassion in his eyes, laid out her case, citing the law from memory, her logic as sharp and clear as winter ice. The friar, who had the ear of the regional bishop, saw a path to justice. He agreed to carry their petition, to be their voice in a world that would not listen. An ecclesiastical hearing was convened in the village church, a sanctuary of neutral ground the Baron could not refuse. He arrived in a flurry of arrogance, flanked by his men, certain of his absolute power. Kaelan carried Ilara to the front of the nave and set her in a simple wooden chair before the altar. She was no longer the broken doll of Kaya Valerus. She was a woman armored in truth. With Brother Thomas at her side, she presented her claim, her voice steady and unwavering. She laid out the intricacies of the maternal inheritance law, her memory a flawless record. The Baron scoffed, presenting his own property ledgers as proof of his ownership. But it was his own meticulous records, his own greedy hand, that damned him. The documents, examined by the friar, clearly delineated the borders of his wife's dowry lands, proving Ilara's claim beyond any doubt. The crowd, the same people who had once scorned her, murmured in astonishment. They saw not a cripple, but a brilliant woman. They saw not a mute, but a man of unwavering honor. And they saw a baron who was not a lord, but a common thief. The verdict was swift and undeniable. Baron Valerus was publicly shamed, his hypocrisy laid bare. He was ordered by the authority of the church to cede the maternal estate to its rightful owner, his daughter. His reputation was shattered, his planned marriage alliance dissolved in the acid of his disgrace. He was left a hollow man, diminished and defeated by the very daughter he had sought to destroy. Ilara and Kaelan did not seek a life of nobility. They moved to the small, comfortable manor house that stood on her mother's lands, a home built of warm timber and fieldstone, not of cold ambition. They used the income from the estate to mend the community, providing grain during a lean winter and timber for new homes, earning not fealty, but genuine respect. Their home became a symbol of earned happiness, a kingdom of two. One cool evening, they sat in the garden as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Kaelan looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a light she had never seen before. For weeks, in secret, he had been fighting his own battle, exercising the muscles of his throat, forcing air past the gate of his grief. He opened his mouth. a sound emerged, tentative and rough at first, then clearer. It was a note, a single, pure, resonant note. Then another. He took a breath, and then he began to sing. His voice, raw and unused but beautiful, filled the quiet air. He sang the song she had written for him, the one about the caged bird who dreamed of the sky. But he changed the final verse. He sang of a bird that had not only dreamed, but had been given the sky, not by mended wings, but by a love that taught it how to soar without them. True nobility, Ilara realized, was not a matter of blood or birthright. It was not found in castles or titles. It was forged in the crucible of hardship, tempered by kindness, and polished by the courage to love against all odds. Worth is not something that can be given or taken away by the judgment of others. It is the quiet, unshakable dignity of the soul, a silent music that plays on, even when the world refuses to listen. It is a strength discovered not in what is lost, but in what is built together, from the broken pieces of two separate lives, into a single, unbreakable song.